Section 16. Facilitators and compensation. Customer or client or no representation. That is the question. Arizona does not leave representation to guesswork. Throughout this course, we have talked about one question over and over again. Who do you represent? That question matters because in Arizona, a real estate licensee should not drift through a transaction as a neutral helper with no clear role. Other states may allow facilitators or transaction brokers, but Arizona is different. Arizona licensees must be very clear whether they represent the buyer, the seller, or both parties with proper written consent. That clarity comes from Article 26 of the Arizona Constitution, which gives licensed real estate professionals the authority to draft and complete documents when acting as a broker or salesperson for the parties or as agent for one of the parties. In plain English, your role must be clear. You are not just helping with paperwork. You are not just putting the deal together. You are not just facilitating. You need to know who you represent before you prepare documents, negotiate terms, or move the transaction forward. The old facilitator problem. Years ago, there was an attempt to treat Arizona agents more like facilitators in certain transactions. At one point, a version of the Arizona purchase contract even included an option that allowed an agent to indicate they represented neither the buyer nor the seller. That may sound convenient, but it created a major problem. If a licensee represents neither party, then what authority does that licensee have to draft documents, negotiate terms, or guide the transaction? Arizona eventually made clear that this approach did not fit our law. That is why today's Arizona licensees must be very careful when using words like facilitator, neutral party, or just helping. Those words may sound harmless, but they can create confusion about agency, duties, and compensation. A real-life example. Imagine you receive a call from a buyer who found a for sale by owner property. The buyer says, "The seller and I already agreed on the price. Can you just write it up for us?" That sounds simple, but before you touch the contract, you need to stop and ask, who do I represent? If you represent the buyer, then you need the proper buyer agreement and agency disclosures. If you represent the seller, then that relationship needs to be clearly established. If both parties want you involved, then limited dual representation must be discussed, disclosed, and consented to in writing before you proceed. What you should not do is say, "I am not representing anyone. I am just writing it up." That is where Arizona licensees can get into trouble. Dual agency and confidential information. Limited dual representation also creates serious limits on what you can say and do. For example, suppose you represent the seller and an offer comes in that would make you a limited dual agent if accepted. Before that offer is resolved, another buyer's agent calls and asks how much the first buyer offered. The seller tells you, "Tell them the amount. I want the second buyer to beat it." Can you disclose the first buyer's offer amount? Not if doing so would harm the buyer you are also representing in limited dual agency. A limited dual agent cannot favor one party to the detriment of the other. You must protect confidential information and remain within the limits of the consent given by both parties. This is why dual agency is not something to treat casually. It limits advocacy. It limits what you can disclose. It requires discipline, documentation, and broker guidance. Compensation is still negotiable. The other major issue in this section is compensation. Compensation has changed, but one thing has not changed. It must be clearly discussed and properly documented. A listing agent should discuss with the seller how the listing broker will be compensated and whether the seller is willing to offer or pay compensation to a buyer's broker. That amount is negotiable. It is not set by law, the MLS, a board, or an association. The seller may agree to offer compensation. The seller may agree to pay compensation only if requested in an offer. The seller may choose not to pay buyer-broker compensation at all. Those are business decisions that belong to the seller after discussion with the listing broker. At the same time, the buyer's broker should already have a written buyer-broker agreement with the buyer, explaining how the buyer's broker will be compensated if the seller does not pay all or part of that compensation. This is where good communication prevents bad surprises. Working with an unrepresented buyer. Now imagine you are the listing agent, and an unrepresented buyer contacts you directly. The buyer wants to see the property. You show the home. They like it. They want to write an offer. This is where you must be very clear. If you represent only the seller, tell the buyer that clearly and in writing as early as possible. Use the proper agency disclosure forms. Document that the buyer is unrepresented. Continue reminding the buyer that you do not represent them if they ask questions that would require buyer representation. You can be honest and fair to the buyer. You can answer factual questions. You can explain that they have the right to seek their own representation. but you should not give them advice that makes it appear you are protecting their interests as their agent. That is how implied agency problems begin. The compensation conversation with sellers. When discussing compensation with sellers, avoid making it sound like there is only one option. A better conversation sounds like this. Seller compensation to a buyer's broker is negotiable. Some sellers choose to offer it because it may help attract buyers who are working with agents. Some sellers prefer to wait and see what is requested in an offer. Some sellers choose not to offer it. My job is to explain your options so you can make an informed decision. That conversation protects the seller because it gives them choices. It also protects the listing broker because it documents that compensation was discussed honestly and transparently. The compensation conversation with buyers. The buyer conversation is just as important. A buyer should understand that the seller may not agree to pay the buyer's broker compensation. The buyer should also understand that if their buyer-broker agreement requires compensation and the seller does not pay it, the buyer may be responsible for the difference. This should not be hidden. This should not be explained for the first time after the buyer falls in love with a home. Explain it early. Explain it clearly. Put it in writing. Why this matters. The theme of this entire course is simple. Do not leave representation to assumptions. Do not leave compensation to assumptions. Do not leave consumers guessing. Arizona real estate professionals should know who they represent, what duties they owe, how compensation will be handled, and what documents are needed before moving forward. When you do that, you protect your client, you protect your broker, you protect your commission, and you protect the public. Broker tip: avoid saying, "I am just helping both sides." In Arizona, that phrase can create confusion. Before preparing documents or discussing terms, identify who you represent, complete the proper disclosures, and make sure compensation is documented in writing. Online discussion question: why is the term facilitator risky for Arizona real estate licensees? Because Arizona licensees should clearly identify whether they represent the buyer, the seller, or both parties with proper consent. Acting as a neutral facilitator with no clear representation may create legal and agency problems. Question: why must a limited dual agent be careful with pricing information? Answer: a limited dual agent cannot favor one party over the other or disclose confidential information without proper authorization. Sharing one party's offer or negotiating position may harm that party and violate agency duties. Question: why should compensation be discussed early with both buyers and sellers? Answer: early compensation discussions prevent surprises, allow clients to make informed decisions, and ensure the broker's right to compensation is properly documented.